The Armada Felicísima is a term that was applied to the Armada by English Catholic exiles. It was total war, total annihilation. We're looking at the demographics of the United States. Within 10 years, it would be a Spanish-speaking country. The term, the Invincible Armada, is sort of mocking term, and we need to create a new Atlantic world. Ireland, Iberia, and Ibero-America. So that whole myth about him playing bows in Plymouth and going out to defeat the Armada is just great propaganda. The Irish, particularly along the west and south coasts, had the closest DNA correspondence with northern Spain and Portugal. And coming from a family that had served the Spanish and the Austrian monarchies in Europe, we in Ireland owe a huge cultural debt of gratitude to Spain. Bathan recommended that Philip should invade and take Ireland first. It is a myth to say that the Spanish Armada was defeated by the small English flotilla. That's a myth. Spain is our oldest ally and friend.
La historia de España e Irlanda es una historia de amistad. Dos países de impronta católica que lucharon por conservar sus raíces cristianas en sus territorios. Una relación que la podemos remontar si queremos a los iberoceltas, que tendrán una especial relevancia en la visión histórica de Carlos V y Felipe II sobre la isla de San Patricio. Un enemigo común en el siglo XVI, la protestante Inglaterra. Y un hecho que marcará el destino común de ambas culturas para siempre, la Spanish Armada. ¿Planearon España e Irlanda invadir Inglaterra? Hoy conoceremos estas relaciones históricas de la mano del historiador de la Universidad de Dublín, Declan Downey. Acomódense porque hoy sí que sí, esta entrevista en trincheras ocultas promete.
We have to remember that it was the Spanish Habsburg monarchy that provided the facilities for Irish culture and literature and identity to survive. So the first plan for an invasion of England, or an enterprise of England if you like, was put forward by Santa Cruz to Philip II and the Royal Council in 1583 after the Azores expedition. Bathan recommended that Philip should invade and take Ireland first. And having secured Ireland as a bridgehead, then you could have a pincer invasion movement. Spanish and Irish forces together from the west and Spanish Burgundian forces from the southeast in Flanders. A pincer invasion from the west and the southeast onto England itself. That was the original plan. But as we know, that was countered by the Duke of Parma, who came up with another plan. By this stage, Bathan or Santa Cruz was dead, and Parma suggested that Medina Sidonia should lead the Armada fleet to Flanders first, and that they would leave Ireland out of it and instead launch the invasion from the southeast, from Flanders into Kent, and take London first. And, well, if Philip had stuck with the original plan of Santa Cruz, things might have been different. But the rest is history. An opportunity missed.
Opportunity missed, like that's so interesting too. And after this episode, we have like, I don't know how many ships, 26, 28 ships, that these ships were shipwrecked in the western coast of Ireland. What was the first impression of the local Irish people there. Like they saw these ships, these Spanish soldiers, these Spanish sailors. What happened with these Spanish people that they survived?
Well, first and foremost, let's get a few things clear. It is a myth to say that the Spanish Armada was defeated by the small English flotilla. That's a myth. Geoffrey Parker made that very, very clear in his work on the Spanish Armada, and he exploded the myth about Sir Francis Drake. There was a skirmish in the Solent, as we know, and the Medina Sidonia and the fleet were driven by the fireships. To avoid the fireships that the English sent in to them, they went out into the North Sea. But Medina Sidonia's chief pilot was a man called Andrew Skiddy. He was Irish, he was from Cork. And Medina Sidonia gave the direction to the Armada to go around the coast of Scotland into the North Atlantic and to avoid the Irish coast, because it was treacherous and you had the equinoctial storms of mid-September of 1588. So 2/3 of the Spanish Armada returned intact to Spain. Less than a third was wrecked on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. That's quite an achievement that Medina Sidonia, who was not himself a naval seaman, he was able to bring most of the fleet back. Philip II had organized field hospitals to receive the injured and the wounded. He provided pensions for the widows and orphans of those who had died. That's in stark contrast to the harsh treatment of English mariners. No provision was made for them by Elizabeth I, and she was criticised for this by her own Hawkins and Howard of Effingham and Frobisher, three of the leading English seamen. And they were also critical of Sir Francis Drake. He only plundered a few cargo ships that ran aground on the Solent, wasn't involved in any action at all. So that whole myth about him playing bowls in Plymouth and going out to defeat the Armada is just great propaganda. But there you are, that's history. And let's say 2/3 returned intact. The ships that did get shipwrecked along the coast of Ireland, some of the survivors were lucky and they came ashore that the Irish they met sheltered them, particularly the O'Rourke of Breffni, the O'Donnells in Donegal, and various others. They helped them to escape. Maguire, Fermanagh and others, they helped them to escape. Hugh O'Neill also helped them to escape, and Bishop O'Gallagher, Raphoe, and Bishop Conor O'Devany of Down and Conor. So they had helped many of the survivors of the Armada to escape through Scotland, and from Scotland to Flanders. There were others who were less fortunate, and they came ashore in parts of Mayo and Galway and Clare, where Sir Richard Bingham, the Elizabethan English governor of Connaught, who had fought with the Dutch rebels against the Spanish in Flanders, took a no-mercy policy. So every Spanish survivor who came ashore there were executed. And we have a situation, for example, in Galway, the city of Galway in the west of Ireland, one of the most Spanish centres in Ireland. Its medieval heritage has a lot of Spanish links. The merchants of Galway had intensive trade with Spain and Portugal. And a number of Spanish prisoners who were brought into Galway were executed by Bingham. And the mayor and the corporation and citizens of Galway protested. And the mayor and corporation actually wrote to Philip II, distancing themselves from the English governor's actions, criticizing him, and informing the king that they had done their utmost to save the lives of the Spaniards. But they also informed the king that the women of Galway took the bodies of the dead Spaniards, cleaned them, wrapped them in shrouds, and gave them a Catholic burial. So that'll give you a sense of the feeling in the city of Galway itself at the English governor's actions. So we know that some Spaniards were unfortunate. They fell into the clasps of the English, and some Irish chieftains who served the English interest. But then every country has its traitors. And for various reasons, some of those Irish probably were under pressure too, that they faced annihilation if they didn't comply with the English. So we're thinking here of MacClancy, Boethius MacClancy, known as the Ghoul with the Axe in County Clare, who dispatched quite a lot of Spanish survivors who came ashore. Grim and grisly work, but there you are. That's what happened. But at least most of the Spanish who did survive were helped by the Irish. That's borne out by the historical record. And we know that Hugh O'Neill kept some Spanish officers. They decided they would stay with him, and they trained his soldiers in the latest techniques of Spanish tertiary warfare, and he was able to deploy that military expertise with great effect against the English himself and Red Hugh O'Donnell in the 9 Years' War that ensued from 1592 to 1601.
Amazing this explanation. I would like to ask you, we were talking about myths. It was the Spanish Armada or the Invincible Armada?
The term the Invincible Armada is sort of mocking term, and I don't call it, and I don't refer to it as La Armada Invencible. I think there's a certain irony that was introduced. It was a mocking term of later use. The Armada Felicísima is a term that was applied to the Armada by English Catholic exiles who thought that this would succeed. And they looked to it as the happy deliverance from the heretic Elizabeth and her minions, the Calvinist International in England. So that's where the ideas come from of the most happy Armada, the Felicísima. But Invencibile is an ironic, mocking term of much later vintage. I think it's a 19th century invention. Certainly, Philip thought that he had created such a powerful force, and yes, he invested a lot into it. There's no doubt about that. But we just refer to it as the Armada of 1588, because let's face it, there are a number of armadas. But the Armada 1588 is what I think is a much more neutral term and a more accurate term. I don't accept La Armada Invencibile.
You don't accept the Armada Invencible.
No.
And another myth, for example, is the Black Irish. I don't know, what do you think about this myth? If you can explain to us what is this meaning of Black Irish people?
During the 17th century, especially in the time of Oliver Cromwell's reign of terror, you have to understand that when Cromwell's conquest of Ireland began in 1649 and it ended in 1653, it was total war, total annihilation. Cromwell's famous phrase was "to hell or to Connaught." In other words, the Irish Catholics would be dispossessed of their lands in the east, the south, the north of the country, and they would be resettled in the less fertile, poorer part of Ireland in the western province of Connaught. And such was the reputation of Connaught that Cromwell remarked that there wasn't enough water to drown a man, enough trees to hang a man, nor enough earth to bury a man. Now, I think it really applies to the Burren in County Clare. But as I said, it was a phrase that was used to describe the poverty of that particular province, and the Irish Catholics were to be transplanted there. That was part of the Cromwellian plan. It was international Calvinism again, remember. Cromwell represented that ideology, and it was total conquest and removal of the Irish, and to transplant the dispossessed Irish land with English Calvinist settlers. So that's where the origins of the Black Irish comes from, because those whom Cromwell didn't kill or transplant, he deported to the English colonies in the West Indies, namely Jamaica and Montserrat, places like that in the Caribbean that had been taken by the English from the Spanish and became English colonies. So on the plantations, you had a number of Irish people who had been removed from Ireland. Some were indentured servants, and some were no better than slaves. That's where they were transported and lived in very poor conditions. As you know, the English brought slaves then from Africa to work the plantations as well. And some of the African slaves and some of the Irish indentured servants intermarried, intermixed. And yes, there were some plantation owners of Anglo-Irish origin as well, who also intermarried with some of the African slaves that they had brought there. Over time, the late 17th into the 18th centuries, you have this group of people emerging in those English colonies who are of mixed racial background, Irish and African, and you'd have people who look like Africans, but they have Irish surnames. And I think that's where the term the Black Irish comes from. So that's the historical origin of
It's not
that
related
group.
to the Spanish survivors of the Armada 1588.
No.
It's
Oh,
not
no, no,
related.
no, no, no. The Black Irish relates to the mixed race people in the English colonies in the Caribbean. That's where it comes from. I think what you're maybe confusing is the fact that here in Ireland, in Irish folklore, people who would have, what we say, jet black hair and brown eyes and sallow complexion were regarded as being descendants of Spaniards who came ashore in the Armada. And that was a sort of a popular folkloric myth, if you like, that emerged in Ireland primarily in the 19th century. And again, you'd find it particularly among pockets of communities along the west coast of Ireland, particularly around Galway. But the DNA analysis tells us that the origins are probably much earlier. People in Ireland who look very, very Spanish or Portuguese, shall we say, look very Iberian in appearance. Yes, you will meet a lot of Irish people who are like that. They're not all fair-haired or red-haired with freckles and pale white skin. They look more like Spanish or Portuguese with the jet black hair and tanned complexion and brown eyes. That comes from centuries of intermarriage between Spanish fishermen and Spanish merchants and Spanish travelers to Ireland with the Irish. It predates the Armada. Going back over time to the earliest settlers from northern Spain. So the DNA can be traced way, way back. So we're talking going way back to the Bronze Age. So as I say, in some places it's probably much higher concentration because of the historic links and interconnections between those parts of Ireland and Spain. As I said earlier, you had a number of places along the west and south coast of Ireland where Spanish fishermen had settled. They had set up salting and smoking factories. Then you have communities of Spanish merchants who were semi-permanent in Galway, in Limerick, in Cork, and in Dingle, and some in Waterford as well. So, you know, there's been a lot of interconnection going way back to the early medieval period between Ireland and Spain. So you have these features, these Spanish features among Irish people, it doesn't necessarily go back to the time of the Armada. It goes much further back in time.
Okay, and I would like to ask you the last question because, as I told you before, I was living in Dublin 1 year, and something surprised me a lot. And when I was talking with loads of Irish people, they told me that Catalonia needs to be independent. And the argument that they have, we can say, is because Spain treats the Catalonian citizens as second-class citizens, as the United Kingdom did with the Irish people.
I think we could devote another program to just dealing with this issue alone. Irish people, because of our own history, a history of invasion, conquest, dispossession, and particularly it's the dispossessing people of their land, outlawing their language or their customs, their religion, etc., their identity. That persecution of Irishness that took place, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, the penal laws, that has left a deep imprint on the Irish folk consciousness and psyche. So when Irish people hear about other peoples around the world who claim they're being persecuted, Irish people feel a natural empathy with them, of course. But I would suggest to you that the Irish people whom you met who said those things to you are a minority. And they're here in Dublin. And Dublin is the most English part of Ireland you can get. And I think that they're not very well informed about the facts in Catalonia. And I think that there may be a political agenda at work there as well, because of a certain political movement in Ireland. Anyone who looks objectively at the facts knows that Catalans are not treated as second-class citizens in Spain. That's an absolute nonsense. Catalans have been at the forefront of Spanish politics and society for centuries. And we know that propaganda, whether it's the propaganda of international Calvinism, of the Dutch and the English, anti-Spanish black legend of the 16th and 17th centuries, or as Julián Cuderías in his wonderful work La Leyenda Negra points out, right across the English-speaking world, there has been this anti-Spanish bias. And that has been used very effectively to distract from the horrific things that the Anglo-American world did to the Indians in North America, the indigenous peoples there. Indian cultures survived in Spanish America and thrived. Their languages were recorded, they weren't suppressed, their identities weren't suppressed. There's a lot of black legend there, but a lot of young people, particularly in the English Pale of Dublin, I think, where you had been, they haven't informed themselves properly, and they've just accepted readily what has been broadcast to them in the Anglophone media.
One of my teachers, he wore a t-shirt like with the independentist Catalonian flag, and I was surprised because I didn't expect it, like this feeling in Dublin.
I think it's a feeling among certain people in Dublin, but I wouldn't ascribe it to everyone in Dublin, and I certainly wouldn't ascribe it to everyone in Ireland. A lot of Irish people have visited Barcelona, for instance, or they go to various resorts along the Catalan coast, and they could see for themselves what a prosperous place it is. We know that the Catalans have their own courts, they have their own autonomy, they have their own identity, their language, etc. is thriving. What are they complaining about?
Thank you very much. I need to tell you for this interview. For me, it was a pleasure.
Just before we finish, if I may,
yes.
Next time some young person in Dublin says to you that the Spanish are being horrible to the Catalans, you can tell them it was Irish tercios who put down the Catalan revolt in the 1640s.
That's right. Yes.
So
That's a good point. That's a very good point. That's a very good point. What do you think about the Hispanidad, Declan? Do you think we can, for example, build new links between Ireland, for example, and not Ireland because it's not a Hispanidad, but with the relationship that we were talking about, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Catholic culture, maybe we can try to plan another supranational entity, or what do you think about
Well,
it?
I think Brexit has changed the whole game here in Ireland. That's the first point. Secondly, we can see Britain in decline. Socially, culturally, politically, economically, it's a mess. Its whole political life has become quite decadent. And when you have politicians in Britain talking openly about breaking international law, the rule of law, and breaking international agreements, that has made various countries sit up and reassess their relationships with Britain. And as we've seen since Brexit, Britain is in serious trouble economically, politically, socially, economically. And I think here in Ireland, observers are looking on in horror at what is going on there. And of course, we see the ripple effects of all of that in Northern Ireland as well. And then we look across the Atlantic and we see the political paralysis of extreme bipartisanship in the United States and the prospect of demagogue becoming the next president there, or the prospect of an octogenarian whose capacities are questionable. It's a frightening prospect. Now, having said that, young people in Ireland who are clued in and who are observing the situation internationally see the advantage of learning Spanish as their second language. And in that regard, I will point to the fact that Spanish is now the most popular foreign language being taught in Irish schools. For years, French predominated. That has changed. Spanish is now being learned by more young people attending school in Ireland. We're looking at the demographics of the United States. Within 10 years, it will be a Spanish-speaking country. Instituto Cervantes is already opening up new centers right across the United States to cater for Spanish language and cultural teaching. Such is the demand. After Mandarin Chinese, Spanish is the most widely spoken language in the world. Anyone with a commercial brain will see the way the future is going. If they want to be engaged in international trade here in Ireland with an open economy like ours, we need graduates with Spanish. So that's the way things are going. And I think that there is a huge opportunity there for Irish people to reconnect with the Spanish world. We were so much part of it in the Middle Ages, and we prospered from it. We were so much part of it during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And the annals of Spanish history during that period is littered with figures of Irish origin who rose to prominence in Spanish political, cultural, economic, and financial life. So that's the way forward I see for this country. And I think that the intelligent young Irish people are already going in that direction anyhow. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity opening up because our government's policy is to increase trading connections with the Iberian world. And when I say the Iberian world, I don't just only mean Spain and Portugal, I mean Ibero-America. We're all Atlantean peoples. The Ireland, we're in the North Atlantic, but our past has shown us that we traded right across the Atlantic, and that's the way forward. And we need to create a new Atlantic world, Ireland, Iberia, and Ibero-America. That's the future for the Atlantic. It's the future regeneration of the West as we know it. The Anglo-American world is in collapse. And the alternative doesn't bear thinking about. So I think we have to be serious, rediscover what we have in common, build on that, and work towards a more prosperous future.
Thank you very much, Declan, for sharing your wisdom here in my YouTube channel. For me, it was a real privilege. I hope to meet you soon if I have the opportunity, of course, because I'm going to visit here more Dublin. I really love this conversation, and I really think that the Spanish people who are watching now this interview, they can think that maybe, why not? We can try to understand another part of our history, these links in common with Ireland. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
And thank you very much, and thank you for your patience putting up with my lengthy answers in English. I'm very sorry, but my spoken Spanish, modern Spanish, is not particularly fluent. You know, I do my research in documents of the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, so I would only speak Castellano Antiguo. And I think that would be rather antiquated, and your audience would fall around laughing at my replies in Spanish. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.